Phil, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody as well. Thanks for attending our session. This is the second session of this series that we're doing. Hopefully, many of you that are attending today attended the first session that we did about 30 days ago, introducing this topic. And if you didn't attend those sessions, you can certainly look at a recorded webinar either on the Integrity site or the ERP Risk Advisor site. So welcome to the session. I'm going to just introduce myself here and let Steve introduce himself as well. My name is Jeffrey Hare. I'm a CPA by trade. Also have a certified internal auditor and certified information systems auditor designations. My background is was originally a client on the implementing the applications back in the late 90s, the divisional controller for publicly traded companies. So I lived in the implementation world, post-implementation world, supporting the applications, and then went into consulting and have been consulting on the EBS space, primarily in the security and controls, the risk and control space since then. Prior to that, I've got experience in Big Four audit prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, but very relevant to the topic and information we're talking about today. And I have both the auditor roles as a Big Four auditor as well as the auditee as a CFO and controller. I was audited. And I'm the author of the only book on the market on application security best practices. As you can see, the name Oracle EBS Controls Application Security Best Practices. And I'll turn it over to Steve to introduce myself, or to introduce himself, my cohort in this presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Coast. I'm the CTO and founder of Integrity. I've been working with Oracle EBS Suite and Oracle products for the last 16 years and focused directly on Oracle security for the last 14. I did a lot of implementation work in my early years implementing large EBS environments, so I've actually had a variety of roles from DBA to apps DBA, very technical. So that will show through on this presentation a little bit. We'll kind of show you kind of the nitty-gritty as we go through and kind of describe this problem in more detail. For those of you not familiar with Integrity, just to give you a quick background, Integrity was founded in 2001, and we specialize in Oracle security. So we both have a product side and a services side. Today we'll talk a lot about what we do in terms of our services by looking at some of these risks, and we'll actually delve into the risks and show you how they work, why they're a problem, and those are some of the things that we do during our on-site security testing. So enough about Integrity, and we'll kind of get started and talk purely about sensitive administrative pages.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to just do a kickoff for the presentation here. Last month we talked about this My Oracle Support Note 1334930.1, and just stepping back a little bit in history prior to this, we talked about a document that this refers to, or is referred to in other documents, which used to be called the Best Practices for Securing Your eBusiness Suite document. And now, I forget the name of it, Securing Your eBusiness Suite or something along those lines. It's taken out the terminology best practices. And the gist of those documents, as Steve's going to point out, is identifying vulnerabilities and then responses or controls to those vulnerabilities in the application. It was originally a document that Oracle put out for 11i, has updated to R12, but as you'll see as Steve goes through this presentation, a lot of the material really was written by Integrity and was copyrighted in that. But the documents, if you want to write the document numbers down, the document numbers for 11i are 189367.1, and the R12 document is 4. Gosh, I drew a blank on it, but we'll put those in the chat box. Both of them are referring to this document where they've broken out what used to be called SQL forms, and now they've changed the terminology to sensitive administrative pages in Oracle eBusiness Suite. So the high-level topic that we talked about last month is how these forms have vulnerabilities in them, and as we put together in the slides, these forms or pages allow a user to modify the functionality of the applications by either using a SQL statement, a portion of a SQL statement, or SQL fragment, such as a where clause, or using something else like an HTML string, or in some cases operating system commands or environmental variables. And through those, they're able to manipulate the data in the form, and as Steve is going to demonstrate today, take control. In essence, it gives them the equivalent access or power of the app's password, and allows a user, a nefarious or a hacker, to be able to do pretty much whatever they want in the application. So it's very powerful functionality. There are a lot of controls that we're talking about in response to this, to these vulnerabilities, and Steve's going to demonstrate several of them today. So I'm going to turn this portion of the presentation back over to Steve, and I'll be available towards the end for Q&A and monitoring your questions as things go. So Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. And another thing about this presentation is different than the ones we usually give ERP risk advisors in Integrity. Typically with our own custom content, we're actually going through and doing the research. And we spent a lot of time in the early years working on this, but we're basing a lot of the information off today's presentation off of Oracle's information. And the main reason for that is when we're talking to clients, they've never heard of these. A lot of them, when we're talking to them, oh, that's a problem, that's an issue. Oh, do we need to be worried about that? You haven't read this MetaLink note yet? Oh, okay, you're missing a pretty big security vulnerability, something that can be easily used to circumvent application security controls. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is based off of this MetaLink note. I will bring it up here. Of course, you can never find it when we need it. So this is the MetaLink note, and the MetaLink note walks through all these different issues. And we'll kind of highlight, what we'll do during this webinar today is actually do a summary and kind of walk through. But the MetaLink note is available out on my Oracle support, and it actually goes through and gives in great detail a lot of the different pieces of information. So basically, what's the general threat? Why are we concerned about this? And really, this is something for your internal users, people who have access to your Oracle Business Suite, and they may not be what you consider a privileged user. Privileged users are typically people with sysadmin, DBAs, and things. But throughout the application, there's a lot of functionality that really allows the application to be extended, customized, make it very powerful. Unfortunately, a lot of those different forms, HTML pages, profile options that give you a lot of power in the application can also be used for malicious purposes. And the basic threat here that we're going to talk about today are these administrative pages that are basically scattered throughout the application and allow you to do things like enter SQL statements that then execute as the apps account. And the reason this is a major problem is really everything happens in the Oracle Business Suite at this one database account called apps. So if I can do anything as the apps user, I can basically take over the entire application. I can enter any data I want, change anything. And a typical scenario here would be is, well, I've got our attacker here who's one of my users, and they have access to some of these pages, and they're basically allowed to enter either a full SQL statement, parts of SQL statements into these web pages. Then what happens is, for some reason, the application will execute that SQL as standard functionality, and whatever the person entered is basically executed. And we'll show you some examples here. We'll show an example of how easy it is to change the sysadmin password or any user password. You can insert vendors. You can update approved purchase orders. You can do just about anything you want. So it's a fairly powerful capability. And as we'll see, is it's throughout the application. It's very hard to find unless you're specifically looking for it. So some of the major risks are basically people are executing SQL statements. Those can either be what's called DDL, so select, insert, update, DML, so you're basically changing things, or basically calling functions. And remember, all these executed apps. So there's a really big risk of fraud or data theft by non-privileged users. So basically, unless you specifically have these pages and functions defined in your segregation of duties matrix, people may have access to these and may be able to circumvent your application security controls. This is also called typically a second-order attack. Typically, the SQL is executed later, so it's not really a direct attack. It's not something that I'm doing immediately. What happens is usually some other application or part of the application triggers the SQL to be executed, and then that's when the actual change occurs. And usually that could be not as my own user, but as maybe a batch process user or something else happening. As in the case of Oracle Alerts, you'll alert a lot of times will be actually executed as another user, and all the who columns are just changed. They won't be my user. So it's a little bit hard to track back to actually who did this unless you're actually tracking them entering the SQL statements into the different forms and things like that. So where are the areas we need to be concerned? This is basically going through the Oracle My Support document. So there's 4 different areas. First, there's forms. So these are professional interfaces, forms. And basically, again, it's controlled by menus, functions, and grants, the typical Oracle E-Business Suite security. And then there's also HTML pages. These are basically the HTML web pages, the self-service type pages, where a lot more of the configuration is being moved out from the forms, the Java interface, into the web pages. Again, these are controlled by menus, functions, and grants, but the control is a little bit different, and when you actually do the queries to look, you need to be looking at 2 different spots, 2 different sets of queries. 2 other areas that are often missed. One is some core features, like the examine feature, and we'll kind of show you how that works, is controlled by system profile options. So you need to be aware that it's not just these forms and HTML pages, but there's some profile options you need to look at also. And then there's also some CRM functionality that has a separate set of permissions. They're called JTF permissions and roles. They also have access control over some of the sensitive administrative pages. So you have to be looking not in just one place, but you have to kind of be looking at a few different areas and to make sure that people don't have access to these pages. And if they do, you're putting in appropriate controls so you know who's accessing them, if they have appropriate access, potentially putting audits on what SQL statements they're executing as part of these pages. So in the Oracle document, they actually list out in great detail. So here's just a partial listing of some of the SQL forms that are allowed to many different users. As you can see, these are spread out. So QA collection plan workbench, write formula. A lot of them are as part of the application object library or FND, but a lot of them are also in different modules. So warehouse management, if you go into WMS rules, you can actually define rules and enter parts of SQL statements and things like that. So these are very powerful, and they're very much spread out amongst the applications modules. And so you do have to be very careful about that. So if we go back to the MetaLink document, Oracle actually has it pretty well defined out. So as we can see, they actually go through function code, function name, internal name, and underlying tables. So there's and if we page through, you can see there's actually 2 pages of different functions and things. So these are even in payroll, order management, warehouse management. So it's not just a system administrator type function. If you've got super users are able to potentially access many of these functions, managers potentially in many cases. So you have to be thinking about that when you're defining your segregation duties matrix, that you're catching all these different forms. So those are the professional interface forms, and then there's also HTML web pages. Again, many of these are as part of the system administrator type function, things that you typically wouldn't grant out to users, but there's a number of them, things that you're actually defining out as different modules. So you do have to be very careful when you're looking through these. So as an example, one of the SQL forms is basically Oracle Alerts. And so what I'll show you now is kind of how this works from a gory detail perspective. But basically what's happening, and so the table is the alerts. And of course I lost my database session, so we need to restart it. Whenever you give a live demo, there's always something that can go wrong. Let's reconnect here. And so what I'm going to show you now is basically we're going to query the alerts table that basically is storing the SQL statements. And if it ever comes up. And so basically what's happening is with Oracle Alerts, users are allowed to enter full SQL statements. These need to be select statements, so it's not just insert your favorite insert statement or update statement or delete all the data statement, but basically it takes a little bit of effort. But as you can see, there's many different alerts. So alerts are used throughout the application modules. And at least 12 alerts aren't used as much as they used to be. In 11i, alerts were very popular and used quite often. But we find a lot of people still have access to these alerts, especially for upgraded systems that a client has run many, many different alerts over the years and are still using them. And often, many different people have access, because if we go through and you kind of look at some of these alerts in here, they're in purchasing, they're in business intelligence, they're in order management, they're in just about every module. So a lot of people have different reasons to use them. As you can see, they're basically full SQL statements. So someone can enter something pretty powerful, either bring back data or execute something else. So we'll actually go give you a demonstration here of how to actually do this. So I'll actually pop out to Oracle Business Suite. So I've actually signed in already. This is a Vision instance. I've actually gone in as the operations user. But that person has full access to Oracle Alerts to define alerts. So I'll actually go in here and define an alert. And we'll bring up the alert form. And we'll just go find a nice, simple alert here to change. We won't do anything too complicated. Which one looks nice here? So how about the sample shows how to send email. So we'll take that one. And I already wrote out basically what's going to happen here, but basically we're going to make a slight change. So this is the alert, and so what we'll do is actually just make a little bit of a change. So instead of just doing a query to bring back some information, I'm actually going to now go in and actually execute a function. This is a standard Oracle Business Suite function, and basically it allows a password change without using the old password. So what I'm doing here is changing the sysadmin password to welcome456 from, in this Vision instance, it's sysadmin right now. And the key here is it's a function call. This is a very standard Oracle eBusiness Suite function call. So if anyone can get access to an eBusiness Suite environment and understands the structure, knows a little bit about SQL, they can very easily figure out what this call is. And alerts run as the apps user, the apps database account. So anything the apps database account has access to, this person can do. So in this case, they can actually call this change password function. And I can now run it as a sample test to see, make sure my SQL works. And this is now actually executing as the apps user in the database. And as one of the things it's doing is it's changing the sysadmin password from sysadmin to welcome456. And of course, I pick one that is going to run for a long time. Whenever you do a demo, things always run longer than you want. So it ran successfully. And so now what we'll do is we'll go switch over, and we'll see if we can do sysadmin welcome456. You can see the password there. And if everything worked correctly, that should basically log me in. I've got my fingers crossed, and there it worked. So basically, I didn't even save, and another key here is as this page is done, I never even saved this. I basically just ran it as a test and was able to run in the background, so I was able to actually execute statements. What we'll do is close this out. It'll ask me to save changes. No. So now that access to an administrative page, that's a pretty commonly granted out one, especially to super users and managers, so they can define alerts. And I was able to actually execute code as the apps user, and no one would have actually known or seen anything different because actually didn't even save it. So this is an example of one of the pages that's more powerful, but there's, again, dozens and dozens of these pages throughout the application, and it allows you to do similar functionality. Each page is slightly different because the purpose of the page is slightly different and what they're trying to accomplish with using the SQL statements. But that's a prime example of using Oracle Alerts. And so now if you go back and look throughout eBusiness Suite, who you granted Oracle Alerts to define alerts out to, all those people can basically execute any SQL they want as the apps user. So that's basically Oracle SQL forms. And then there's also profile options is the next area. So there's the SQL forms, the HTML forms, and now there's actually some profile options. So the profile options are mostly related around the diagnostic functionality and the examine functionality. There's also when you do for the framework personalizations, you have the capability there also to change the way the application is working, and there are different things. So we'll go through and actually show you the examine feature now. So again, this is often granted out, sometimes not purposefully, but well, that one person needs access to it. We see many more problems around the SQL forms being granted out inappropriately versus the examine function, but I can't tell you how many people actually have the examine function that probably shouldn't, especially when you're going through a large upgrade project or implementation, it gets granted out to quite a few different users. When you go to production, no one thinks about going back and actually revoking access to all those users. So we'll actually go now and switch to, let's pick a nice one here. Let's go maybe into HR. We'll actually bring up a person. We'll actually go enter and maintain a person. So let's type in Mr. Smith here and bring up Mr. Smith. We'll see how many Mr. Smiths are in the vision environment. Usually there's quite a few. So we'll take Alex Smith would be a nice, good employee. So now the examine functionality allows you to go in and basically actually change parts of the record. And so even if you don't have access, you can potentially change without entering any apps user. So for this example, the operations user has actually been granted the examine profile option. So they can actually see the diagnostics menu as well as actually use the examine functionality. So there's two different profile options. One of the profile options blocks access to this diagnostic menu item, and then the second can actually block access to the examine functionality. And if you don't have the profile option, it actually asks you to enter the app's password. So in this case, we'll actually change, let's change Mr. Smith's first name. So we'll actually bring up part of the record. And so even if I didn't have enough privileges to do this type of functionality with the examine, I actually do. I can change the records behind the scene, and we'll actually now change it to Steve. And so it kind of changes it on the record. You see how it went from Alex Smith to now Steve Smith. And so that's basically how the examine works. And so by granting out that profile option, you can actually give people access to elements of the records and allow them to be changed. So one of the issues with the profile options is it's a little difficult to actually figure out who has access to these because there are layers of the profile options. So what we'll do is actually look and show you a query of the different profile options. So this is kind of one of Integrity Standards queries, so we actually bring up the different profile options. So as you go see, the F&D diagnostics here is set at the site level. Actually, we want diagnostics here. It's set at no, it's appropriately set. So basically at the site level it's set no. But in this case, one example is the HR setup user actually has it set to yes. So one of the things you need to always be checking is not only is it set appropriately at the site level, that you're reviewing in terms of what users or responsibilities or applications might actually have access to each of these profiles. That's one of the interesting things that is, when we do a lot of the security assessments, both the ERP risk advisors and Integrity, a lot of our work is actually doing on-site security assessments. And we'll say, we'll say, yes, we definitely set you to this diagnostic. No, we checked it. But then when you actually go into the details, we actually find a large number of users that have it set, oh, there's a business justification, or, oh, by the way, that person got set during the upgrade project because they needed to troubleshoot something, and now we're in production, and they clearly should not have that access level. So that's one of the issues is going through on the profile options and going into the detail. Often it's set right at the site level, but typically there are maybe 20, 30 users who actually have it set at the user level. So that's the profile option. So basically, when we look at the profile options, you need to make sure that these values are set. It's recommended that you're hiding the diagnostics menu entry as well as disabling the diagnostics. So there's really two profile options that work in conjunction together. One is you want to hide it so people can't see the menu, and then secondly, go and disable the diagnostics so they can't even do it. And if they can access the examine function, they have to enter the app's password. And typically, only the DBAs should have that password. Another area we won't talk much in detail, but for CRM has some separate permissions called JTF permissions and roles, and these are some of the features that within CRM that allow you a little bit more control and ability to enter some SQL statements or fragments of HTML, things like that. So within the email center, some of their CRM components. If you are running CRM, this takes a little bit more effort. If you're not running CRM, it's not as much of an issue because typically users won't have access to these types of functions anyways. So when we're looking and talking about the sensitive administrative pages, the key here is you really need to be looking at your SOD matrices and making sure that all these functions are listed. Individual pages are appropriately excluded from most users, and you understand the risk. The biggest thing is understanding the risk of these pages, because it's not only looking at data or just changing data. You can basically do anything within the application, especially circumventing other application security controls. One of the problems that we do run into is, well, the Oracle listings are pretty good. They're pretty extensive, but we routinely find, especially Jeff Hare does a very good job about hunting out and discovering new pages that allow you to enter SQL statements that aren't listed on Oracle's support document. So think about the support document as it's a really good starting point, but it's not complete. Just due to the complexity of the application, there's a couple dozen pages that are missing from their listings, and it's very difficult to identify every page and form. This is a giant application. There's 40,000 different web pages and forms that you can use and access, and has someone gone through every single one and figured out exactly is there a SQL statement or not, what can you potentially do with that? And then finally, the user accesses at a function level, so it's got to be reviewed. It's very difficult to identify these privileges because when we're talking about menus and functions, you can also define your own functions to some of these forms. So not only do you have the listing from Oracle of their functions, it's possible to define custom functions within the application security that point to the same form, and you would never realize that unless now you're looking not only for the specific functions, but now looking for the specific forms that are a problem. The Oracle queries are really based off the function level, and if you've got your own custom functions, you really need to modify the Oracle listings and the SQL scripts. Oracle's provided some SQL scripts to help you with this, but again, this is based off their listing. It doesn't include any custom functions that you may have defined. So what we'll do here is bring up the Oracle queries, and we'll kind of show you. They've done a nice job, but unfortunately, it's a SQL query. So this is provided if you go into My Oracle Support and bring up this MetaLink node here. You'll actually see this script at the end, and you can actually execute this in your environment. So basically, what these scripts are actually nice, and if you're looking for SQL scripts to actually pull up different profile options at different levels, it's very good. If you're looking to pull up different functions and see who has access to the function, these are actually very useful SQL scripts and reusable for many different things. So the scripts basically have four different components. The first one is basically a query to bring up the profile options. So here they're looking for those 3 different profile options and then actually listing it out at the different levels. Very similar to the output I just showed you a minute ago. Then they're actually going in and looking at the forms via responsibilities. So here they're basically pulling up, and again, this is how complex this is. The query is very good. It's joining, how many tables are we joining together here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Joining 6 tables together, so not complicated at all. But basically here they're just listing form by form. So here's the Oracle Alerts form that I just showed you. And so they go form by form and are trying to bring up who's got actually access down to a function level for those different forms. So they've done a pretty good job, but if you have a custom form that you've copied from one of the standard forms for some reason, that wouldn't be on this list. So you always have to remember that any customizations would probably be excluded from some of these queries. But again, this is the complexity. So every time Oracle or someone finds a new form that maybe will allow SQL to be entered or something like that, you actually then have to modify the query to actually include that form. Oracle security has also been changing, so now there's also grants, so they actually have to search both at a function level and at a grant level. So they're kind of doing both here, again, looking up for grants to different forms. And then those are the SQL forms. Then you also have to look for the web pages. So the web pages are a different call. So again, they're looking at going for or web page by web page, and this is kind of the definition of the web pages. So if you have any custom web page definitions that are basically using either the standard Oracle web pages or using a custom web page that would be copied from a standard web page, you have to include those. So again, this is pretty good as a starting point, but there's a lot of little caveats then that could actually allow someone still to access some sensitive pages that you wouldn't be aware of. And again, not only HTML pages, but now HTML pages via grants. And then finally, it pulls up the different JTF roles. So the scripts are very good. Recommend everyone runs them to bring back the information. But now the fundamental problem about running these scripts is they can bring back a lot of data. So we ran this against the Vision environment, and so we'll actually see how many rows got brought up. So this query basically brought up the first one that goes for the forms and functions. It brought up 24,000 rows in the Oracle Vision environment. So this is pretty typical. We see it sometimes bring up 500 rows, sometimes bring up 20 to 30,000 rows for a typical client environment. So again, this is a lot of data that now someone has to go through. And as you can see, a lot of these are super user responsibilities. So a lot of people have access, and so this also brings across different menus. So you'll see the same data coming up over and over and over based on menus, based on multiple users, things like that. This is very difficult to weed through and figure out who should really have access, who shouldn't have access. So not only you can run the SQL scripts, bring back the information, but it does bring back a lot of data, and you have to be aware of that. That was for the forms. If you look at grants, and grants aren't used typically as much in the Business Suite environment, so that brought back no data. Again, now there are forms. Now we have the same amount of data, or similar amount of data in terms of the HTML. Fortunately, HTML isn't used as much, but again, 1,500 rows. Again, some of these are typical system administrator, but again, here within the Vision environment, sales user responsibility has one of the SQL web pages. So create custom SQL page has been granted out to sales user within the Vision environment. So that's probably one of those responsibilities that shouldn't have that level of capability to allow you to basically test different SQL pages. And then grants are used more for web pages than forms. So here is listing for all the different grants to different HTML pages. Again, this one is actually just a couple different web pages. That's about it. And then again, the JTF is now another area if you're running CRM. You have to look at not only forms and web pages, but also the JTF permissions and roles. So that's kind of an overview of the Oracle SQL queries, showing you the output, kind of what the capabilities are there. So sensitive administration pages basically really should be going through change management. That's one way to capture some of this information. So you should be looking through all these different forms and web pages to see, okay, who should be accessing them, and we should actually have some sort of change management process for them to make sure that people are actually looking at, we're auditing, we're sampling what kind of SQL statements are being entered. If it's going through change management process, you can actually include and require a DBA or peer review for the SQL statements. This also comes into a performance. If someone's actually putting in some ugly SQL statements in there and you're running it quite often, that can cause a performance problem in your environment. So not only should you be reviewing it for a security reason, but also for performance. One of the things that we don't recommend is often people say, okay, let's put in a review here and actually have IT security or auditors review it. We don't really recommend that because they're not qualified to look at the SQL statement level. A DBA typically is much more qualified to review the SQL statement. They can review it, one, for performance, and they also understand the data model for the Business Suite. They understand what that SQL statement would be doing and why that weird function call is in there or not in there to maybe change the password. They would probably be kept. Someone would probably catch the name change password, but there's many, many different function calls in the Business Suite that are ambiguously named. You aren't quite sure what it does. And DBA would be more likely to see and say, okay, investigate a little bit more versus an IT security person who probably doesn't understand the data model through eBusiness Suite. And then finally, putting some audit and access both at the page and form level, so you know who's actually accessing them, but also on the tables. So the alerts table, having an audit to actually see all changes happening to the alert table to see what SQL is being entered is very beneficial and meaningful because then you can actually sample on that access and table changes to review if what people are doing is appropriate. If it's actually going through the change management, you can sample back to actually the change management process and make sure that there's an appropriate ticket ID and that was authorized to be done. For the profile options should be part of the change management process. When Jeff and I do our assessments and audits, we find very often that people are allowed to change system profile options and not have that go through change management. Profile options can do a lot of different things to the entire environment, changing all the way from the way GL works to, in this case, allowing access to key sensitive processes that allow you to bypass the application security controls. You should be auditing all changes to profile options. Depending on which version you have, the EBS audit trails actually doesn't work on the system profile option values table. So you may actually have to use database auditing. That's one of the database audits we always recommend every client implements, because then you have a full change. How many times have you ever been in that situation where you're actually trying to troubleshoot a problem and all of a sudden you find out, well, the result of the problem was basically someone changed the profile option value, and the first thing you always do is change it back real quick. But you don't ever capture that history because within eBusiness Suite, it only captures the last who column. It doesn't capture what actually changed. So if you have a full audit on profile option values, you can actually see every single change, what happened, what the before and after values were. It actually helps in troubleshooting. In this case, it very much helps in security and auditing of the application to know if the sensitive ones are being changed. And then finally, when you're reviewing the profile options, we see a mistake. A lot of people actually just review it at the site level. They don't get down into the user level to see which users actually have access to which profile options and what they're doing with them. Because a lot of times, a person during the upgrade or maybe troubleshooting a problem got assigned diagnostics, and they're allowed to now use the examine function, and no one remembered to take it away from them at the appropriate time or when you went live or after the upgrade was complete. So we see that quite often. So you have to remember profile options can be set at multiple levels, and it's very critical to actually audit down at that level. So that was kind of a brief overview of the sensitive administration pages, just to talk about why these are important, to give you some concrete examples of what you can do with those pages and how easy it is to circumvent application security controls, and kind of going through some recommendations on what you should be looking for and how you should correct the problem. This webinar came out of a series of webinars we're doing. A couple weeks ago, we talked about hidden security threats, and this is the first webinar to detail out one of the problems. In May 23rd, we have actually the second of this series that's now talking about the password decryption threat. So within the eBusiness Suite, it's possible to actually decrypt passwords for application users. That's very powerful that now I can go into my development environment, get all my production application user passwords, and then I'm off to the races in terms of doing procure to pay fraud, that type of thing. That's coming up May 23rd. In terms of other resources, actually, on the Integrity website, we actually have a lot of different white papers. This presentation will be available both on Integrity's website and ERP Risk Advisor's website the next day or two. And I'll turn it back over to Jeff so he can kind of talk about some of the resources that he has from ERP Risk Advisors.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. And a great job covering a lot of a lot of detailed information throughout the presentation. So a couple of things that we have for resources. We have a first one is internal controls and security list server is a public domain list server. So if you have questions, certainly Steve and I make ourselves available. Just simple email questions. We do respond both of us in a timely manner. If you want more of a forum to be able to present questions, the Oracle SOX used to be just focused on SOX issues, but now it's kind of broader in nature. That's a public domain forum that anybody can sign up for. The second one, the internal controls repository, is a group we have set up just for end users, and we are very particular about how we administer that site, so it's just end users that get access to it. And the purpose really there is to share some information with end user organizations that we don't want in the public domain for particularly your external auditors to come in and get information and have additional resources to be able to tackle some of those challenges that we've discussed today, or just in general. We do put screenshots and updates on new SQL forms that we find into that if you're keeping track of all SQL forms that should be analyzed and monitored. To the extent that we find them, we'll put them in there and send an email out to the group. My book is available on Amazon. And I think Steve, there's the notes that I couldn't think of earlier, that R12 note, the 403.537.1, he notes those, and then he's got the notes on the DMZ configuration.
Yeah, and the notes on the DMZ configuration are very important. We see a lot of people who are implementing iSupplier, iRecruitment, iStore. When we do reviews of those, it's very poorly done. Oracle has a lot of issues. It's a very large application, and if you basically put it on the internet without going through the appropriate security configuration, you're basically putting a lot of web pages on the internet that you don't need to. So if you're running iSupplier, you only need access to maybe 100 web pages. By default, there's 20,000 web pages. And so the DMZ security configuration actually walks through that process on how to lock it down and kind of fix some of the major security issues and risks with the eBusiness Suite because it's such a large application.
So there's our page as well, for the webinar access page that's available on the link of our home page as well. We also do a 10,000-foot, we call it 10,000-foot assessment. That's free. Details of that are on the page. Kind of go over some of the basics we've covered here, but some other areas in particular that we cover in the best practice application security best practices books. If you're interested in that, our contact information will be here in another slide or two.
All right, next
there it is. Yep.
So as Jeff said, definitely feel free to contact us at any point if you have any questions. It's one way that we can actually fine-tune our messages to see what people are asking us, what are some of their main concerns and problems, and then we can have webinars in the future. Some of the webinars we do, like the next week on the password decryption, will be in a couple weeks, is purely based out of how many people say, well, I need more information on that. I really need to understand how that works in detail.
I'm glad we finished a little early here because we have about 5 questions people have asked.
Excellent.
The first one is, what responsibility gives access to the alerts? This was asked earlier.
Yep. I'll take that one real quick. It's the alert manager responsibility that it comes by default in that. The caution I would give you is don't assume that that's the only responsibility that has access to that. So it's important to use a query like this or some type of tool to be able to get access to a comprehensive analysis on which responsibilities have access to certain functions. So it's important to go back to that function name. And then Steve, I'm not sure what you're doing behind the scenes here. You're trying to find us through some other places that have it.
Yeah. So I was basically just sorting it by function name. So, alert. And this is a vision environment, so your environment will always be different. But basically, as you can see, there's a lot of different responsibilities. Application administrator. I don't know what Sizzle Tools is, but here in Vision, UK HRMS Setup Manager has access to it. So there's a lot of different responsibilities. So it's always important to actually run the actual queries to figure out down to the function level and the form name who has access to it.
Next question. Will this type of update reflect the row who columns correctly?
Do you want to go ahead and answer that, Steve?
I can referring to basically when I went through into the Oracle alert and actually executed that change password. In this case, in the way that form works, because I was able to run it, I never saved it, so the who columns would never have picked it up. So that's actually a specific issue with the Oracle alert page. Other pages typically force you to save it and it has to be executed, so you could have an audit. But there are certain cases, like the alerts, that you can go and define alerts and actually run the SQL statement without actually saving it. And I don't think there's any audit that would actually pick that up.
Well, that's the next question. And executing an SQL statement from the alert form and not saving on the form, does it still log in the alert? Does it still log in the alert file for the database apps?
In terms of an actual audit, unless you're auditing that actual SQL statement being executed, I don't think there would be pretty much thinking through just a standard, pretty aggressive auditing that we've turned on for many customers. I can't think of a scenario where that actually would have been picked up. That would have been picked up if I had something on FND user and I'm actually looking at the password changes. But in terms of anything related to the alert form, no, I couldn't. It basically just gets run. It never gets saved anywhere.
Yeah, and I'll just add a comment there. I mean, you talked about having an audit on the FND user table. When we kind of go through an analysis of what needs to be monitored, that would be an area that we would recommend, password resets being a high-risk area in general. The challenge really is, do you have the processes related to that data to do something about it? So a procedure that says we're going to evaluate changes to password resets, and we're going to do a call back with the user and say, did you, on a random basis, did you reset your password? If there's an issue with somebody getting logged out of their account and they call the help desk to be able to reset their password, then the help desk should look at the log files to see if there has been an attempt to reset the password. So those are some ideas. In general, it's a good question because as we've demonstrated some other webinars we've done, just using the illustration of a bank account change, which obviously is high risk related to procure to pay, even if it's done through the alerts form or something else, the auditing being done on the supplier table, the TCA tables in R12, should identify those issues. So your overall audit strategy in terms of what we need to deploy to be able to identify some of these risks that are these backdoor risks, our primary mechanism is auditing the highest risk areas in the application, like password resets, supplier master changes, bank account changes, and a whole wide variety of other things that we have. I did see another question come in. I guess I'll address Phil if I'm on this topic, is what tool would you recommend to audit setups? And Steve and I probably both have our opinions on this. I think a comprehensive analysis of auditing tools and technology is necessary. I typically focus more on the application side, and we prefer the use of triggers to audit configurations or audit setups, which I would look at alerts as one of those. The FND user table would be one of those. The question we always get when we recommend deploying triggers on a database is there going to be a performance impact? And the response to that is we typically don't recommend any triggers be placed on transaction tables. High volume transaction tables, typically we're deploying those triggers on lower volume tables or configuration and master data tables. So we tend to avoid, not that you can't deploy a trigger on some transaction tables, we tend to avoid those because those are the areas that there could be the most amount of risk to performance. So we get asked that question a lot, and if I didn't address a question or entirely, if you have a follow-up question, you can submit it in the box, or you can contact me directly. And Steve, you have some in terms of audit trails. Do you want to kind of talk about database roles and logins and those type of things that it's more in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, so basically you have to remember also with the database application is that if you're auditing application level activities that you can do with triggers, with different tools, you also have to remember at the database level you need to have some sort of audit trail there to capture database logins, changes to like database users, database privileges, those type of things. Auditing is not just one tool, one solution. It often is a comprehensive strategy to look at what you're doing in terms of database auditing, application auditing. There's a little bit of operating system logging, application server logs are also there. So when you are thinking about just auditing, it's not just, oh, I have to turn on a couple of trigger-based audits. No, you have to look at multiple layers, application server, operating system, database, application, in order to have a comprehensive audit. And those are typically different tools or different technologies all involved. So it's really auditing as a strategy. It's not just a silver bullet tool that comes in and turns everything on. And let me go back to the previous question also on, in terms of the alert I did and the demonstration I did, the question was, is it reflected in the who columns? And it actually is, because when we go back and look at the actual statement that I executed, and this was actually a very good question and very observant of somebody. The statement I executed was this. I'll actually bring it back so I can put them both together. It was actually a standard EBS function call to change the password. I didn't change the password directly. Potentially, I could have also updated the FND user table directly and put it in, potentially tried to update the password directly or something like that. That wouldn't work because I need the app's password. But in this case, I called the standard EBS function, which actually picked up the username, because this function, when it actually does the password change, uses the currently logged in user, which I currently was logged in as operation. So we go back down to the who column, last updated by ID 1318, which actually is the operations user, which I was actually logged in. So in this case, that specific way I did it to change the user is actually reflected in the table. But there's the interesting thing about doing these type of SQL attacks is it's basically a language. And because it's a language, I can do just about anything I want. It'd be very powerful in the different types of attacks. If you look through the eBusiness Suite, there's thousands of functions. I can pick a different function that may not actually do an update to the table, because I might pick a lower level function that even changes the password and it doesn't do a login, because that's done in a higher level function. So there's many, many different things you can do. In this example, caught it. I would not assume in all cases they would be caught.
Yeah, I'll comment on that because we've demonstrated in another SQL Forms tech webinar that it did a few months back that through the use of the alerts form, we changed the bank account and then changed it back. And that was one where we demonstrated where the row who information was not updated the way we built and executed that. So if people want to see that, there's a specific webinar on that topic on our website.
All right, next question. Change management of profiles should be selective. Which ones? Don't you agree? Copies of reports is intended for end users.
So that's a great question on you're talking about profile options and change management related to that. Yes, we do have a process that we go through, typically kind of a risk assessment, if you will, where we would allow end users to update certain profile options. So this is a longer topic, but we've done a YouTube video on this. If you're talking about those going through the system profile options form or the change process, that's one subject. And yes, we think that some of those profile options are low enough risk it shouldn't have to go through formal change control. But the going in point would be all of them go through change control until you've established the risk related to some is insignificant enough where it doesn't warrant going through change control. Having said that, also, we find that one of the biggest risks that organizations have is the user profile values or the personal profile values form, which gives the ability of a user to change thousands of different profile options to override at the user level where something maybe is set at the site level responsibility or application level. So we highly recommend the removal of the user profile values or personal profile values form from all users. Or if you're not going to remove it, that the list of values has to be changed using the custom TLL to restrict it to just a certain small group of profile options. So again, that's a topic we've talked quite a bit about. There's kind of a we've started a risk assessment related to this, and we're starting to track those things that are, you know, black, white, and gray, some things that are low risk, some things that are high risk, and some things that could be in between, and that's one document we share on the internal controls repository. And certainly we're looking for feedback from, you know, the user community as well to help build that because there's, you know, 8,000 plus profile options in an R12 environment. It's impossible for us to have expertise, domain knowledge on all those, the risks within those.
Next question. Like the way we have an option to check function assigned to responsibilities. Do we have a similar option to check any column or field assigned to different tables?
Do we have a similar option to check column or field assigned to different tables? So you're talking about, like, for example, I think what you're asking is, can we identify what functions or what processes, like the current programs, call what tables and what columns, so we would know all the places where a column or a table or a column within a particular table can be accessed. And there isn't anything that I know of related to that. There's some third-party processes that may have, or consulting services that may be able to help you with that. But do you have any comments on that, Steve?
No, that's actually a very difficult proposition, is to say, okay, I've got a column with the data, where in the application is that actually used? And there is no very good way to do that. Especially because you're talking about potentially concurrent manager programs, HTML pages, professional forms pages. There's lots of different things that the application can touch, and going down to one column, where is this actually used throughout the application is very difficult to figure out.
Yeah, and I'll add one other comment to that. You're talking about peer review process earlier, Steve. To me, from a development standards perspective, so SDLC process, you made the comment that Oracle doesn't always keep up with this. We find some things, you guys can find some things. Well, to me, the fact that we're finding things that aren't documented within their own best practices document indicate the deficiency in their development standards, because nothing should be deployed in their environment until all the documentation related to the risks in that form of deployment, such as our conversation today, those have been, all the documentation been properly updated. So the same would be true of any development internally, to the extent that you know you have sensitive data in certain tables and columns, and you need to protect that data. Your SDLC standards, your development standards, should identify that somebody needs to make sure that you have a central repository of what can access that data, that you're working on your scramble scripts if you're doing scramble scripts during the clone process, and so on. So development standards are a whole other topic of risk, and there's a lot of things, you know, that need to be in there from a controls perspective, but that's kind of another topic altogether.
All right, next question. So we could say we should never see a user have an update from another user unless the user doing the update is an admin.
Yeah, we basically, when Integrity performs our assessments, one of the things we do look at is we have a specific report that looks through about 15 different things. One is users, and so we actually analyze and group by on the last updated by and created by columns who did that, and we actually give the client a list saying, okay, this is who updated these users in the last couple months. We do it by month and username, and 10 times out of 10, they'll come back and say, why did Jack he shouldn't be updating anybody. He's a help desk user, and he's not even allowed to change passwords anymore. So very often, that is actually a very good check, is to actually do that group by on like FND user and look at last updated by, created by columns and who's actually doing it, and often be surprised on who's actually doing something there. So that's one thing we do check. We also do check it for menus. We check it for concurrent manager programs, responsibilities. We check all those different things to see who's actually changing those values. And some things pop up occasionally that you're very surprised about, especially on users, because password changes are often an issue on who's actually doing password changes and who has that responsibility. You'll see somebody who has supposed to be just in there making printers or something, and they end up changing people's passwords just because that's the easiest thing to do, because so-and-so wasn't around that night and somebody had to go and do it.
Okay, I think that about wraps it up for the day's e-learning session. I thank everybody for the attendance today, and please stay tuned for the next session, which will be on May the 23rd, in which, again, Steve Coast and Jeff Hare will be talking about, or exploring, if you will, the account password decryption threat within the Oracle E-Business Suite. So thanks again for everybody for your time, and have a great rest of the day.